The MC of this story, Vikir von Baskerville, was once known as the loyal hound of the infamous Baskerville family, a man who followed their orders to the letter, no matter how dirty the job. But his reward? A death sentence, handed down by none other than his own father. That should have been the end of his story, except it wasn't. As his head bowed under the looming guillotine, Vikir accepted his fate. He was falsely accused of conspiring with the demon clan, and now here he was, seconds away from death. The world around him was silent, but inside his heart, a storm raged. He shut his eyes, bitter to the very end, muttering one last wish to himself. If he ever got another chance at life, he'd never live as a loyal hound again. And then he opened his eyes. But this wasn't the afterlife. He wasn't staring up at the guillotine. Instead, he was lying in a cradle, his body tiny and weak, his head too heavy to lift. The cries of infants filled the air around him. Disoriented, he wondered, was this hell? No, it wasn't. He had been reborn, right back in the Baskerville nursery, surrounded by hundreds of other children. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed through the room. Hugo La Baskerville, the ruthless head of the family, entered, his cold gaze sweeping over the cradles. He sneered, dismissing the crying babies as worthless trash. But when his eyes landed on Vikir, something made him pause. Unlike the others, this child wasn't crying. Without a word, Hugo ordered him to be placed in the cradle of swords. And in that moment, Vikir's eyes burned with hatred, the same hatred that once brought the guillotine to his neck. He remembered everything. This was the same Hugo who'd sentenced him to death. Now, Vikir fully realized what had happened. He'd been reborn into the same cursed world, in the same poisonous family. But this time, he wouldn't repeat his mistakes. In his past life, he had been born from an illicit affair, left to grow up in filth and poverty, obeying Hugo's every cruel command like an obedient dog, all for the faint hope of being acknowledged. And in the end, his reward for that blind loyalty had been death. But now, he remembered it all, the grime, the humiliation, and the brutal betrayal. He was just a child again, yes, but there was fire in his heart. What Hugo didn't know was that placing him in the cradle of swords would one day become his greatest mistake. The cradle of swords, the most brutal test in the Baskerville household. Infants were tossed onto a spiral table lined with thousands of razor-sharp swords. To escape, they had to crawl across the deadly blades to reach the Styx River, a mystical river said to turn the bodies of chosen children into iron. But the river didn't accept just anyone. Only those who could conquer it and take it by force would survive. Vikir didn't hesitate. He dragged his tiny body forward, his flesh tearing on every blade, blood spilling with every inch. The ground was slippery and the pain was overwhelming, but he only had eyes for one thing, the Styx River. In his past life, his brothers had pushed him off the table before he could reach it. But this time, no one would stop him. He stumbled, covered in wounds, and finally fell straight into the river. The icy waters flooded through his wounds, seeping into his very bones. It burned, like his body was being melted and reforged in fire. Still, Vikir refused to give up. He gritted his teeth, enduring the unbearable agony. He would drink every drop if that's what it took. Outside, the attendants panicked. They pleaded to pull him out, terrified that he'd die. But Hugo simply watched, amused with a twisted smile. When asked how long the child had been submerged, Hugo's butler reported 7 minutes. Hugo laughed darkly, mocking that maybe the child would finally die. Still, the attendants begged him to intervene. At last, Hugo shouted for Vikir to stop and come out. But Vikir wasn't listening. He didn't care. He wouldn't stop now. He wouldn't waste this second chance. He stayed submerged, letting the river turn his very bones to iron, determined to survive no matter what. When he was finally on the verge of drowning, a strong hand yanked him out. Hugo himself, still wearing that smug grin, intrigued by the boy's sheer tenacity. He muttered, amused, that Vikir was a greedy little beast, trying to drink the entire Styx River. Then Hugo's eyes widened in surprise. Vikir already had teeth. When he asked for the child's name, the butler replied, Vikir van Baskerville. Hugo's wicked smile deepened. A very greedy son indeed, he chuckled. Vikir, half-conscious and gasping for air, glared at him with burning hatred. Deep down, one thought repeated in his mind. He'd chew Hugo's head off with his own teeth someday. He'd crush the entire Baskerville legacy with his bare hands. Vikir was the illegitimate child of Hugo La Baskerville, born from scandal and dismissed as trash. But by the time he turned 8, it became clear that he wasn't ordinary. He was sharper, smarter, and far more dangerous than other children his age. Still, in a family where bloodline ruled everything, he was just another disposable pawn. As he grew older, Vikir carved his own path, choosing a life of assassination, espionage, and warfare. By 20, he'd completed countless bloody missions. Yet, while others were crowned as nobles, Vikir remained in the shadows, unrecognized and unwanted. Then, at 30, disaster struck. The demonic train was unleashed upon the world, plunging it into chaos. But Vikir, now a seasoned warrior, fought on the front lines, cutting down demons day after day, soaked in blood and teetering between life and death. He battled for 5 long years, until the war finally ended and humanity emerged victorious. His reward? Not honor, not glory, but betrayal, a false accusation of treason, and the cold kiss of the guillotine. But this time, things were different. As Vikir opened his eyes, he could still feel the Styx River's iron flowing through his veins. His new life had already begun better than the last. Just then, the door creaked open. A maid quietly entered, muttering to herself, confused why she'd been ordered to leave a certain item in the child's room. Vikir's ears perked up. A madam in the house, sending something to a child? That wasn't normal. The maid placed a box near his bed and left. Vikir's sharp eyes watched the box closely. As soon as it opened, 2 venomous vipers lunged straight at him, fangs bared. His heart raced. He knew exactly what this was. In the Baskerville house, only a handful of people held the title madam, and all of them were ruthless. Clearly, this was no accident. Someone wanted him dead. In his past life, such an attack would have been fatal. But now, he wasn't some helpless baby anymore. Without hesitation, he grabbed both vipers with his bare hands. Their venom seeped into his skin, burning like fire, but his grip only tightened. In his eyes burned a single promise. One day, these very hands would crush the entire Baskerville family. By morning, the entire household was in an uproar. Everyone was stunned to find Vikir peacefully sleeping, surrounded by the corpses of 2 dead snakes. No one could figure out how the vipers had gotten there, but one thing was clear. Someone had sent them. To save face, all the nannies on duty that night were brutally executed after torture. But the real truth? Only Vikir van Baskerville knew what had really happened. Years later, Vikir sat calmly in a classroom, now 8 years old. Swordsmanship lessons were underway, the instructor explaining the levels of mastery. A beginner couldn't imbue their sword with mana. An expert could manage just a little. A graduate could produce a liquid-like aura. But the ultimate level, a sword master, was when the aura became solid and fully controlled. The teacher then mentioned a name, Sir Hugo La Baskerville, the most powerful swordsman of the Baskerville family. A true swordmaster. The entire classroom froze in shock. The name Sir Hugo echoed in their heads like a god-tier legend, but Vikir wasn't even tuned in. His mind was elsewhere. After all, he had just reclaimed the power he'd lost before his regression. That raw force, the same one that kept him alive for 7 freaking minutes in the deadly Styx River, was humming inside him like a quiet storm. The teacher noticed it too. Sure, Vikir's eyes looked blank, but that body? It radiated the kind of survival energy only monsters had. The Patriot would have definitely cracked a grin if he'd seen it. But Vikir wasn't thinking about admiration or validation. His only thought, how many damn years would it take to take Hugo down for good? Meanwhile, 3 pairs of eyes were locked on him from a dark corner of the room. The triplets. 3 smug little bastards, highbrow, middlebrow, and lowbrow of Baskerville. Only 9 years old but already full of rot. After class, they strutted over, tried to shove him around, and started throwing dirt on his name. Called him trash. Mocked him for the Styx River dive. Laughed off the snake kills as tall tales. But Vikir's gaze sharpened like a blade. He remembered those 3. In his past life, they were the ones who'd sold him out and stuck knives in his back. Hugo's little trident. He knew it even back then. These punks were going to be trouble in a decade. But this was time to handle things early. One of them suddenly whipped out a knife, joking about the rumors that staying in the Styx too long turned your body to steel. Another one suggested they test it out. The third clamped Vikir's mouth shut from behind, setting the challenge. 3 minutes of stabbing resistance. If Vikir could tank it, he'd eat his own hand. Vikir didn't fight it. He stood still, silent. 1 minute passed, then 3, then 10. The blades bounced off like they were poking a statue. Not a scratch, not a drop of blood, just dead silence and 3 kids slowly turning pale. The rumor wasn't a rumor. It was damn fact. They backed off, rattled and bored. But then Vikir moved. Calm as hell, he reminded them of that little promise about the hand. Next thing they knew, one of the triplets screamed, missing a finger. Vikir spit something out and dropped it. Yeah, he bit it clean off. The 1-fingered triplet panicked. The other 2 lost it, talking about running to a priest, trying to reattach the damn thing. Vikir didn't even blink. His voice got colder than ice. Why not keep playing the game? That fired one of them up. He pulled out his blade, full of pride and stupid confidence, ready to put Vikir in his place. After all, Vikir was technically younger. But when that knife made contact, it bent. Useless. Vikir's skin was like damn steel. Then Vikir grabbed his arm, twisted it like it was made of rubber, and gave him a reality check. Around here, it's not age that makes you someone. It's power. Then came round two. He twisted harder. The screams bounced off the classroom walls like a horror movie echo. This was Baskerville. The strong live. The weak break. Silence fell. The triplets were flat on the floor, wrecked and shivering. Vikir stood above them, calm, merciless, completely cold-blooded. No fear, no pity, just a dead stare as he crouched and dropped a brutal truth. They'd survive with treatment, sure, but no one's leaving that room just yet. That pain? It's their new teacher now. And just as they started processing that nightmare, Vikir gave them a twisted little mercy. Said he'd allow one of them to walk away. Hope lit up their eyes. But then he dropped the knife between them like it was nothing and turned to leave, only pausing to throw one last grenade. The clock's ticking. One of you better stay alive. He stepped out, leaving the door open just enough. Inside, all hell broke loose. Screams, punches, blood, nails, betrayal. Brother turned on brother. Survival of the sickest. And on the other side of the door, Vikir just stood there, listening to it all. Every gasp, every crunch, every scream. With a twisted grin of satisfaction, he knew it. Baskerville's so-called Trident wasn't a team anymore. They were enemies now. All three. And it only took one move. Meanwhile, Patrick Hugo Luke Baskerville sat in his office, calmly listening as head butler John Balmore ran for the latest updates. The Moore clan was out here claiming Ruby Mine like it was theirs, but Hugo just shook his head. Let them talk. When they finally show up in person, that's when the real conversation begins. John continued, moving on to the report from Juvenile Fortress. The interim evaluation results were in, and Master Vikir had casually bagged the top spot in the written exam. Hugo let out a faint smile, solid stuff. But then the vibe shifted. John's voice dropped, and his expression turned cold. Something had gone down. Hugo didn't waste time with guesses, just asked how many were dead. None, thankfully. But what followed wasn't much better. The triplets had turned on each other. Highborough got his teeth knocked out. Middleborough had his jaw shattered, and Lowbrough, one of his fingers had to be amputated. Hugo's face tightened instantly. Those three were always thick as thieves. What the hell could have pushed them to this? That's when John dropped the real shocker. It wasn't an outsider. They went head-to-head with Vikir. And just like that, Hugo went silent. Vikir stood in front of him. Patriarch Hugo watched him with a faint grin, noticing how much had changed. The kid had grown, not just in height, but in presence. He moved like someone who'd seen hell and come back swinging. But Hugo wasn't here for small talk. He brought it up straight. The three senior brothers, all older by nearly a decade, were wrecked. Not just physically, though Vikir casually mentioned they'd already gotten treatment and were fine. That wasn't Hugo's point. It wasn't the bruises or bones. What got broken was deeper, the kind of wound that doesn't heal with medicine. The bond between brothers had cracked. That was what Hugo saw. Vikir didn't flinch. He met Hugo's gaze head-on, calm and unbothered, almost challenging. From his eyes, it was clear he didn't believe he did anything wrong. He was stronger, more dominant. That was the only logic he followed. Strength justified the outcome. That's how the world worked, especially in Baskerville. Still, Hugo let out a sigh and told him the brothers had forgiven him. That word hit Vikir differently. Forgiven? His expression didn't shift much, but something stirred beneath. He closed his eyes for a second, and the past came rushing back. Another life, before regression, a girl who had once come to see Hugo, now a nun, her entire family wiped out by the Baskervilles. And yet, she'd come to offer forgiveness. Hugo had said something back then that Vikir never forgot, and now it echoed within him louder than ever. Forgiveness is just a cover-up, a lie told by those too weak to take revenge. Only the powerless pretend to move on. And in Vikir's voice now, there was a chill, a sharp edge, the same kind of fire Hugo recognized in every true-born Baskerville. A spark that meant trouble, but also greatness. Hugo gave a small nod and glanced at the butler, Balmore, telling him Vikir could take whatever he wanted from the food storage, whatever he could carry himself. Vikir responded instantly. He wanted chocolates. Not just any snack, he had something else in mind. On the way to the storage, Balmore casually mentioned that the chocolate was a rare import from the Moore clan, a big deal among German nobles. But Vikir stopped mid-step. Eyes narrowed, voice steady. He didn't want any of that processed rich kid junk. What he asked for was raw, real, cocoa beans with deep, bold aroma. That threw the butler off for a second, but he didn't question it. Orders were given. Soon, the chef came back with a pouch filled with reddish-brown beans, bitter, raw, and rare. One of those bloody beans could produce almost 100 liters of chocolate. But Vikir didn't blink. He popped one into his mouth and chewed without flinching. The chef and butler watched, a little stunned. How much did this kid love chocolate to go through that bitterness without even a grimace? The chef offered to process them and send the finished product to his room, but Vikir refused. He'd carry it himself. For a second, the butler wondered, was this just some kind of weird flex? A test? Or was there more to it? But Vikir wasn't here for games. To him, those beans weren't dessert. They were part of strategy. Something was brewing in his head for the upcoming practical exam, 5 days away. Except, none of them could have predicted what was actually about to go down. A historic shift was on the horizon, something Baskerville had never witnessed before. A quake strong enough to rattle the foundation of the clan itself. In this world, the Baskerville name carried weight. People called them the Berserker clan for a reason. And that title came with blood-soaked roots and a brutal training system that bordered on barbaric. Training started the moment a child could walk. They were forced to run uphill, non-stop, forbidden to rest until the exact allowed time. Nights weren't spent in beds, but next to monster corpses, so their minds learned fear just as much as their muscles learned survival. But the real nightmare didn't even begin until they turned 8. That's when the evaluation began, an ordeal that would either forge them into warriors or crush them beyond repair. Just outside Baskerville's territory was Lenore Mountain, a place where even the air felt hostile. Behind every rock, something was probably waiting to tear you apart. Now that same mountain was crawling with young hounds from the Baskerville clan, including Vikir casually carrying his cocoa beans, like this wasn't about to turn into chaos. But this time, something was going to go down that'd stay in clan history forever. Right at the base, all the young masters stood lined up. No one was talking. Just silent tension across every face. Every breath felt like a mix of hot blood and cold fear. In front of them stood Pavlov von Baskerville, the clan's shadow dog. The guy didn't waste time. He dropped the rules straight. 1 month. Survive in the jungle. Hunt monsters. That's the test. But this wasn't just about staying alive. There was a whole point system. 10 points for surviving. 30 if you take someone out and make it out yourself. 50 if you kill a monster and don't die. 90 if you do all that. But no one gets 100. Sir Hugo said the second you think you're unbeatable, you're done. Pavlov made it clear, everyone had a badge. Steal someone else's and you score bonus points. But if you die, you get nothing. He pulled out a map, marked the zones. Some parts were off limits, locked down for a reason. No-go areas full of stuff they weren't ready to handle. The safer zones? Already cleaned out. But shadow dogs would be hiding everywhere, watching, scoring silently. The second Pavlov left, the pressure doubled. Some people glanced at Vikir. Whispers started. This was a guy who passed 3 shadow tests alone. He looked solid, but he wasn't even glancing at them. His eyes were locked on Lenore Mountain, like he already knew the place. The triplets near him were sweating hard and arguing like kids. One didn't want to go center, another called the left path safer, and the last one wanted to lead like some action hero. Pavlov gave them all one last look. Wished them good luck. Then the bell hit. The moment the bell rang, chaos broke loose. Participants scattered in every direction like they were being chased by ghosts. Some bolted uphill, others sprinted straight toward the caves, everyone hungry for that early game advantage. One guy dashed off toward last year's shelter, hoping to outplay the rest with familiarity. Another dude followed right behind, plotting to tag along and then backstab him for the first chance he got. Meanwhile, a trio of triplets were still stuck in a petty ego match, wasting time arguing instead of moving their asses. Up on a nearby rock, Pavlov had taken a high ground, calmly observing the madness below with hawk-like eyes. He wasn't just watching for fun, dude was worried. The goal wasn't to rack up bodies. Killing wasn't banned, but the system wasn't a fan either. Do it, and your points drop. While all this was happening, a shadow dog was silently tailing Vikir. But this kid? He wasn't playing like the rest. No frantic sprints, no fights, no dumb flexes. Instead, he walked straight to the restricted zone like he owned the damn place. That caught the shadow dog off guard. Was this really the genius people kept hyping? Vikir stopped near a massive, ancient tree, crouched, studied the ground, then smiled. The soil was soft, perfect for camping. While everyone else was bleeding for points, this kid was chilling, collecting sticks, swinging a wooden rod for practice, then straight up crashing under the tree, like it was a casual Sunday. The shadow dog? Losing its mind. This guy was wide open and not even trying to hide. Time rolled by, and still no combat. Vikir kept digging, setting traps, staying cold, and calculated like he was prepping for a storm no one else saw coming. Eventually, the shadow dog bounced, deciding this snooze fest wasn't worth the watch. The moment it left, Vikir exhaled with a smirk. Now the real play could begin. Sitting by the fire, he tossed in a few bloody beans. Smoke curled upward as he moved through old survival routines. Ones that masked scent, ones that brought back memories. He checked his gear and nodded to himself. Everything was ready. The tail was gone, and it's time to hunt. Days passed. Vikir crossed into the restricted zone, looking unfazed on the outside, but scanning everything like a predator. Every crack in the dirt, every twisted root, it all came back to him. This was the terrain he used to scout in a past life. As he pushed deeper, the air changed, thick with burnt wood and scorched earth. Then he saw it. A stool reduced to black ash, but surprisingly heat still clinging to it. That was the sign. The monster was close. And then it showed itself. The hellhound. It burst out from the shadows like nightmare fuel. 3 meters tall, flaming jaws, eyes burning hotter than sin. Every step it took scorched the earth. This thing was a walking inferno with a risk rating of B+. Vikir locked eyes with it, muscles tight, brain sharper than ever. He knew what this beast could do. One bite, and you'd be reduced to a pile of ashes. He'd survive it once, barely, back when he was 18. But now, he was just an 8-year-old. Facing it alone was suicide. The hellhound charged, and Vikir dipped to the side, already playing the first rule in his head. Those beasts couldn't turn, just straight-line sprinters. He splashed water on the ground. Second rule, they couldn't cross water. As expected, the monster curved wide, losing momentum. That was the window. Shallow water slowed it. That's when the third rule came into play. Canine beasts ran with open mouths. When it lunged again, roaring fire, Vikir was locked in. He hurled a bloody bean straight down its throat. Screams tore through the air. The monster staggered, howling in agony. That bean is a lethal. A single one could make enough chocolate to kill 100 dogs. And this monster just swallowed it raw. Vikir didn't waste time. He gripped his sword, eyes fixed on the unarmored spot near the beast's kidneys. One swift, surgical strike, and it was done. The hellhound collapsed. Vikir stood over the corpse, breath heavy but eyes calm. XP flowed into him like power on tap. His limbs felt lighter, stronger. The grind was working. Hugo's face was going to be priceless when he saw an 8-year-old stroll in with the corpse of a B+ rank nightmare. Vikir barely had time to relish the moment of victory when the grass around him stirred with a sinister rustle, followed by the unmistakable growls of more hellhounds stepping into the clearing, their eyes burning with fury as they advanced like a pack of demons hell-bent on vengeance for their fallen kin. But instead of panic, Vikir stood perfectly still, expression cold and unreadable, eyes narrowed with sharp intent, as if silently acknowledging that things had just gotten a whole lot more interesting. His sword was already back in his grip, fingers casually brushing over the remaining bloody beans in his pocket, ready to be used like landmines. And with a wicked little smirk curling at the edge of his lips, he lifted the severed head of the dead hellhound and flung it into the air, a brutal taunt meant to provoke the pack into charging straight at him. But something didn't feel right. Instead of lunging, the hellhounds froze in place, their growls dying into whimpers, and their aggressive stance gave way to something almost unthinkable: fear. For a split second, even Vikir felt a twinge of confusion, because these monsters weren't known for backing down, ever. They were born to kill, not cower. And yet here they were, retreating, eyes darting toward the trees like they'd seen something far worse than death itself. That's when the earth rumbled beneath his boots, slow and heavy, like something massive was stomping its way into the battlefield. And as Vikir turned toward the sound, his breath hitched in his throat. Emerging from the dense forest, with smoke curling from its mouths and heat rolling off its skin like waves from hell's furnace, was a creature that didn't belong in this region, or this realm. Cerberus, the 3-headed beast of legend, the final guardian of the dead, a towering 7-meter-tall monstrosity usually confined to the 7th ridge of Lenore Mountain, where tortured souls are said to rot for eternity. Its arrival here wasn't just unnatural, it was impossible. And yet, there it stood, bleeding from multiple wounds, arrows jutting from its hide, fire still simmering at the edge of its breath. It wasn't here to fight. It was on the run. Vikir's mind raced as realization hit him like a freight train. Someone had tried hunting Cerberus down, forcing the beast to flee in desperation, and by some insane twist of fate, it had wandered straight into his lap. The danger was immeasurable, but so was the opportunity. If he could kill it now, while it was injured and distracted, he wouldn't just make history. He'd become a legend, the youngest warrior to ever bring down an A+ ranked monster. And he didn't waste another second. Tapping into the raw power flowing through his veins, blessed by the cursed waters of the river Styx, and unleashing the refined, brutal swordsmanship he had honed through relentless battles against the demon clans, Vikir exploded into action, each strike surgically aimed at the beast's legs, slashing tendons and hammering at weak points with surgical precision. At first, it worked. Cerberus faltered under the assault, limbs buckling from the pain as blood splattered across the forest floor. Vikir could taste victory on the edge of his breath. But it only took a second of hesitation, a blink, a moment too long, to flip the tide. Cerberus lashed out with terrifying speed, its claw crashing into Vikir's side with enough force to lift his body off the ground like a rag doll, launching him into a tree trunk that cracked on impact as blood gushed from his mouth and bones fractured under the sheer pressure. He collapsed to the ground in a broken heap, pain flooding his nerves as the world blurred around him. Barely conscious, he blinked through the dizziness, staring down at his trembling hand, half expecting it to be gone, but it was still there, shaking, bloodied, but intact. The river Styx's enchantment was barely holding him together, shielding his torn flesh from completely giving in, and he let out a shaky breath of relief that didn't last long. Cerberus roared again, louder and closer, and every fiber of his being knew the next hit would be the last. There was no choice. He had to run, with no pride left to hold on to and no time to hesitate. Vikir pushed his body up and took off into the forest, not out of fear, but with the clarity of someone who knew exactly when to fight and when to survive. Cerberus gave chase, its three heads howling like sirens of death, closing the distance with terrifying speed as Vikir pushed every last drop of adrenaline into his legs, sprinting for his life through the thick brush and gnarled roots until, finally, he spotted it, a rusted iron fence in the distance. That fence marked the edge of the restricted zone. Beyond it, safety, or, at least, a chance at it. Heart pounding like a war drum, he pushed harder, lungs on fire, the roars of the beast closing in with every breath, until he reached the gate and threw himself through to the other side. Cerberus was still coming. The hunt wasn't finished, and Vikir knew the clock was ticking. He had to get to the final safe point, the dungeon hidden deep within the forest where shelter might finally stop this nightmare. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself up, every step feeling like knives were slicing into his legs, but his mind stayed locked in. He wasn't running blind. This was part of the plan. He'd prepared for this. Buried between the trees up ahead was his trap, a pit carved deep into the earth and lined with sharpened wooden spikes, each one laced with bloody bean extract, a toxin uniquely lethal to canine-type monsters. That pit was the ace up his sleeve, and as he spotted it just a few feet away, he timed his move with brutal accuracy. With a sudden twist of his body, he dove forward and rolled to the side, just as Cerberus leapt after him, landing squarely into the trap. The impact was devastating. The beast's monstrous weight drove the spears through its flesh like hot knives, and the howls that followed shook the leaves from the trees. Foam poured from its mouths, the agony unbearable even for something that had walked out of myth. But Vikir didn't flinch. His gaze stayed locked, cool, and unfazed, because he knew better than to celebrate too early. Cerberus was wounded, not dead. And that's when he reached for the final weapon, an old wooden spear he had buried long ago, its tip embedded with the venomous fang of a bloody mamba nose, a toxin so potent the victim could only take 7 steps before their body collapsed, paralyzed by death. Vikir's eyes narrowed as he hurled the spear with everything he had left, the weapon slicing through the air and slamming straight into Cerberus's ribcage. The beast let out one final roar and started moving. 1 step, then 2, then 3. Each one heavier than the last. 4, 5, 6, and with the 7th, all 3 heads dropped like rocks, slamming into the earth with a dull, thunderous crash, until silence took over. No more roars. No more chase. Just a crater filled with a lifeless legend. Vikir exhaled, chest rising slow and steady, eyes fixed on the fallen beast in front of him. 3 massive heads, dripping blood and death, now nothing more than a victory he had earned with blood, sweat, and ruthless preparation. Cerberus, the A+ monster that once ruled myths, was now just a trophy in the dirt. But even as the high of victory lingered, he already knew the next headache. How the hell was he going to haul this thing back? Because anyone who looked at the scene, who saw the pit, the poisoned spear, and the trail of blood leading to it, would know damn well who had done this. Vakir's eyes, still alert from the chaos that had just unfolded, suddenly caught on as something strange, something that didn't quite belong. Cerberus was known as a gatekeeper, and where there's a gatekeeper, there's always a gate. A dungeon. That realization hit him like a jolt of static, and his pulse spiked with a kind of anticipation that only a true hunter could feel. Because if this really was a dungeon, then the treasure buried inside could very well be the kind of relic that not even his past life had come across. And Vakir wasn't about to waste time fantasizing. He knelt beside Cerberus's body, scooped up a smear of its dried mana, and smeared the foul, musky substance all over his skin. It stank like death, but it had a purpose. Low-tier dungeon creatures feared Cerberus's scent like the plague, and this was his shortcut through them. That primal instinct, the one that separated survivors from corpses, kicked in hard as he scanned the forest floor, analyzing broken twigs, disturbed soil, and the damp trail of roots half buried in the mud. Every mark left by Cerberus told a story, and he followed it like a silent shadow, weaving through the woods until he reached a place where the ground rotted beneath the trees, sinking and soft, thick with the stench of old magic. He could feel it in his bones the moment he stepped forward. This place wasn't new. He had been here before. Not in this life, but in another timeline where this exact dungeon had been discovered a full decade later, already looted and picked clean by the time anyone got to it. But right now, the air was so dense with untouched mana it pressed against his chest with every breath, as if the ground itself had been swallowing power for centuries. He didn't hesitate as he stepped inside, descending into a suffocating blackness where not a single sliver of light existed. But he wasn't afraid. His crimson eyes flickered faintly in the dark, cutting through the void, sensing the pulse of something ancient and rare ahead. And then, slowly, the shadows began to shift. Walls lined with dull red stones began to glow faintly as he moved deeper, revealing veins of ruby embedded into the walls, mineral-rich and unmistakably connected to the nearby Red Door Mountain. Then, somewhere far down the corridor, a shimmer caught his eye, a faint, otherworldly glow radiating from a single direction. His pace quickened. The space around him blurred into speed until he reached it. The room that greeted him looked like it had been frozen in time. Right at its center stood a pedestal, and on it sat a massive ruby, radiating its own raw mana, so intense it seemed alive. A crystal of unknown power, a piece of magic untouched by history. But before Vakir could even process the full weight of what he was seeing, his eyes caught something else, something colder. In the corner of the chamber, partially hidden in shadow, was a skeleton. He approached slowly, each step crunching over blood-stained cracks in the stone floor, each groove telling tales of violent clashes long forgotten. The dried streaks and deep gashes all hinted at one thing. A brutal, drawn-out battle had happened here, long ago. Lying next to the bones was a folded piece of parchment. He picked it up and began to read. The writer called himself Cain, but also wrote that he didn't want to soil such sacred paper with his name, which already said enough. The more Vakir read, the clearer it became. Cain was from the Baskerville bloodline. And not just him, his twin brother Abel, too. The letter unfolded the story of how the two brothers had spent years fighting monsters, navigating near-death trials, and chasing the myth of the stone chamber passed down through generations in their family. After all that, they found it. This place. But what awaited them here wasn't treasure. It was a riddle. A cruel one. A test that kept them trapped for 3 years. Vakir's gaze drifted back to the ruby on the pillar. That gem wasn't just pretty. This was the core of the puzzle. The inscription on the pillar read, "When entering it's one, once inside it's two, when leaving it's one again." It sounded simple, but it wasn't. According to Cain's final words, he and Abel believed the solution was about unity. Only one could leave, so Cain killed his twin, thinking sacrifice was the key. But nothing happened. The door never opened. The riddle remained unsolved. And Cain had realized, too late, that the chamber was cursed. Nothing here was meant to be claimed. It was a trap disguised as a prize. Vakir stood there, letting the silence sink in as his thoughts began to race. That same puzzle was now staring him down, daring him to fall for the same illusion. But he didn't have a twin. There was no Abel. Just him. Then it hit him. Cain and Abel made the same mistake by thinking they were two separate beings. But the answer had never been about people. It was about perception. Turning around, he stared at the tunnel he had entered through, and for the first time, everything made sense. When he entered the darkness, he was one. But as soon as the light hit him, it cast a shadow. He became two. and when the light vanished, he'd be one again. That was the answer. With clarity sharp as steel, he gripped his sword and drove it straight into the ruby. The impact cracked it open, and a blinding burst of light exploded through the chamber, wiping out every shadow, every echo, until suddenly, everything stilled. Then the ground rumbled beneath his feet, and the far wall began to move. Slowly, stone shifted and light spilled in from behind. And what Vikir saw next made his heart slam against his ribs. Inside the newly revealed room was a sword, dark, terrifying, powerful. It pulsed with a black-red aura, radiating an ancient, demonic pressure. The blade was resting on a slab of stone, and it felt less like a weapon and more like a living curse waiting to be unleashed. As he stepped closer, his eyes locked onto the inscription carved below it. Only one with Baskerville blood may wield this sword. Vikir's lungs froze. This was the sword of Beelzebub. Memories rushed in, half-forgotten flashes of childhood, of reading about a monstrous fly-shaped demon that nearly tore the continent apart. A beast stopped only by the 7 founders of the ancient clans, and the very first among them had been the founder of Baskerville. It all came rushing back. Beelzebub wasn't just a monster. He was part of the devil's holy constellation, one of the 7 destroyers, and this blade had been forged from his corpse. Once stolen by the demon clans, the sword had become a tool of massacre, turning entire human battalions into ash. And now it was here, and it was his. Vikir reached for the hilt, and the second his fingers touched it, something ancient surged into his body, burning through his veins with overwhelming force. In pure reflex, he stumbled back, eyes wide, only to watch the sword disappear, vanish into thin air. But seconds later, it reappeared, emerging from his own hand as if it had fused with him, become a part of his very being. Beelzebub's sword was no longer an object. It was now bonded to him. The weapon buzzed with energy, shrouded in smoke and darkness, and his own aura flickered in response, as if the two were now one. He felt unstoppable. Power coiled inside him like a live wire, begging to be unleashed. But as he explored the rest of the dungeon, he realized there was nothing else left, just silence and stone. He turned to leave, but his body betrayed him. A sudden burn spread through his stomach, not pain, but a searing hunger unlike anything he'd ever felt. He collapsed to his knees, gasping, hands shaking, and that's when the truth hit. The hunger wasn't his. It was the sword's. A dark voice echoed through his mind, hollow and ancient, whispering the truth he didn't want to hear. This was Beelzebub's hunger, and now it lived inside him. Panic clawed at his chest as he stumbled through the dungeon exit, barely staying on his feet. Every step felt like fire, every breath heavier than the last. And then his arm twitched, not by choice but by command. The sword was pulling him. It dragged him, silently, instinctively, towards something, until he found himself back where it all started, in front of the body of Cerberus. And the hunger only grew stronger. What happened next wasn't something that could be explained by human logic or magical theory. The blade began to drink. Not in the metaphorical sense, but literally like a monstrous parasite. It latched onto Cerberus's corpse and started siphoning blood with a thirst that felt both ancient and evil. Each drop consumed with a sickening devotion, as though the blade wasn't just taking blood, but stealing the very essence of the beast's rage, pain, and primal soul. And Vikir, standing still amidst this gruesome ritual, felt something shift inside him. The hunger he had carried ever since awakening in this life. The gnawing emptiness that pushed him to sharpen his mind, harden his body, and move like a phantom in a world of predators, began to ease, not from satisfaction, but from resonance. It wasn't his hunger alone anymore. A question surfaced in his mind like a whisper from the void. Was it Beelzebub's hunger that had drained the forests, dried the rivers, and silenced the wildlife around the mountains? It suddenly made sense. This sword wasn't just a cursed weapon. It was a living relic of ruin, and now it belonged to him. Yet as the final traces of blood seeped into the blade, a strange calm fell over the chamber, and from the sword itself came what felt like a sigh of twisted satisfaction. Vikir exhaled too, a breath that came not from relief, but from realization. He was finally starting to understand what this weapon truly was. As he studied its form, his eyes landed on the slots carved into its obsidian-black surface, raised, sharp, and humming with raw mana. That's when he saw it clearly. Beelzebub's inherited ability, the infamous glutton of fly, wasn't just a passive curse. It was an active, growing nightmare, a weapon designed to absorb and evolve by consuming the abilities of its victims. And not just physical strength, it devoured skills, traits, the very things that made monsters monstrous. Each drop of blood was a contract, and each kill was an upgrade. A sword that got stronger with every feed. But with that strength came a cost. one that could never be fully paid. Because its hunger had no end, no limit. Over the years, it had stolen from warriors, drained enemies, and erased legends who thought they could wield it. Vikir knew that danger intimately and didn't pretend otherwise. That's why he had already set his own boundary, not more than 3 abilities. Any more, and the blade might begin to take more than just what he allowed. As of now, Beelzebub's slots were fully loaded. Slot 1. Hemorrhage Hellhound, a brutal B+ rank skill, harvested from Cerberus's vicious biology. It would ensure that any wound inflicted, no matter how minor, would bleed until death, slow, unstoppable, merciless. Slot 2. Burn Injury, an A+ rank trait also from Cerberus, capable of inflicting searing thermal pain, the kind of pain that breaks warriors long before it kills them. Slot 3. High-Speed Regeneration, a humble F-rank skill, absorbed unintentionally from a crushed sewer rat Cerberus had fallen on during its collapse. A surprise, but one Vikir accepted without complaint. As the devouring process continued, Vikir sensed the damage risk. If the body was overabsorbed, questions might arise during the upcoming practical exam. So, with calm precision, he extended a hand and signaled the sword to stop. The sword, as if whining like a spoiled child having its toy taken away, trembled with frustration. But Vikir stood firm. He gently calmed it down with a light pat and a quiet command. Enough. The sword obeyed, albeit reluctantly. Now fully prepared, Cerberus's corpse was left in perfect condition to validate Vikir's actions during the Academy's practical exam. And so, he waited in the shadows of the Baskerville estate, observing from a distance as the days passed and the excitement built. When the results were finally released, a ripple tore through the clan like a sudden storm, because this time, a single name was echoing on everyone's lips. Vikir von Baskerville, an 8-year-old hound who had single-handedly brought down an A+ ranked Cerberus. No one could believe it. Far inside the cold stone walls of the main estate, Hugo Baskerville, the clan's feared patriarch, sat in silence at his study. Surprise lined his weathered forehead as he reviewed the reports, listening intently while his head butler explained the details. The boy had entered a restricted zone, they said. Cerberus had already been wounded by a rogue barbarian hunting group. Vikir had finished the job with a poison wooden spear, a clever method that left no trail and no trace in the official hunting journal. When asked what kind of poison he used, there was no answer. The boy hadn't written it down. He hadn't told anyone. That silence made Hugo smile. This wasn't just talent. This was intelligence, covert, calculated, and dangerous. The kind that turned survivors into rulers. Butler hesitated before adding one final comment. It wasn't about Vikir, it was about Van, another hound who showed exceptional promise. Hugo's smile only deepened. He didn't care about bloodlines. He forged hounds based on their capability, not lineage. And in his mind, Vikir had proven himself worthy, not just as a hunter, but as a player in the bigger game. Not long after, Vikir was summoned. Standing in front of Hugo, calm, composed, eyes locked forward without a trace of fear, he carried himself like a soldier, not a child. When asked how he had killed Cerberus, his answer was layered in mischief, cloaked in innocence. He had used chocolate, he claimed, which was fatal to canine monsters. It was an absurd lie, but one that was delivered with such straight-faced charm that Hugo couldn't help but laugh. It was then he realized this boy had been thinking multiple steps ahead, even before the fight. Every request, every detail, even asking for chocolate before the mission. It all made sense now. This wasn't a conversation between father and son. It was a negotiation between two tacticians, each playing a role. And when asked why he didn't credit the butler, Vikir's cold response hit like a dagger. Because the butler wasn't his master. His master was the clan's legacy, the name he carried. That answer earned a nod of approval from Hugo. As a reward for slaying Cerberus, Vikir was given full command over the fallen beast corps, and the highest practical score meant he was granted a wish. Without hesitation, he made his request. Access to the 10,000 epistle library. The room fell silent. That wasn't a prize, it was a declaration. The 10,000 epistle library was the most dangerous archive in the Empire, locked in the heart of the Baskerville estate. Even heirs weren't freely allowed in. Only Hugo and a chosen few had that privilege. And now, Vikir, an illegitimate child, wanted in. When Hugo asked if he understood what he was demanding, Vikir said nothing. But in his heart, he knew, if he had been denied, he would have found another way inside. Because this was his goal. This was his path. To everyone's shock, Hugo granted permission. But he didn't stop there. He told Vikir to study the 6th technique of Baskerville, located in the 6th restricted zone. It was unheard of. A child with Van in his name, often dismissed, never even allowed to access the fourth technique, now had the keys to a power that generations had fought to reach. For a second, even Vakir was stunned. The sixth technique was no minor script. It was a forbidden method, once believed too dangerous for anyone without pure bloodline authority. And yet, he had it now. Vakir quickly steadied his expression. Outwardly, he treated it like nothing. But inside, he knew. This was a moment that could define everything. Because Hugo, in this lifetime, had mastered up to the seventh technique. In the previous timeline, he had reached the ninth. But even at that height, Hugo had never treated Vakir as his equal. Always an outsider. Always the bastard. But now he wasn't asking for recognition. He was taking it. His eyes were already fixed on the founder's ultimate sword technique, the one used to end the reign of the seven great disasters. The final sword text, the legacy of Baskerville. And as Hugo quietly smiled, calling him a hound with a true target in sight, Vakir simply bowed in return, eyes sharp with ambition. Because this time, he wouldn't be denied.